News of Canada threatening to sever the land route to Alaska hit Washington like a blizzard. Unthinkable, yet suddenly real. The corridors of power in the U.S. Capitol buzzed with disbelief and urgency. For decades, the idea that a friendly neighbor could become a roadblock to American territory seemed impossible. Yet, overnight, the unimaginable had become a headline, and the stakes were higher than anyone could have predicted. The Alaska Highway, once a symbol of unity and shared sacrifice during World War II, now stood at the center of a diplomatic storm. This vital artery, stretching through thousands of miles of rugged wilderness, had always represented the deep trust between two nations. Now, it was transformed into a bargaining chip, a point of leverage in a high-stakes trade dispute that threatened to unravel decades of cooperation. The Canadian message was unmistakable. They would not be pushed around, and their geography gave them a powerful hand. By controlling the only land access to Alaska, Canada reminded the world, and especially the United States, that even the closest allies have limits, and that respect must be mutual. The White House was caught off guard. What began as a dispute over tariffs had escalated into a direct challenge to American sovereignty. Advisors scrambled to assess the consequences, realizing that the economic and political fallout could be enormous. How had a disagreement over trade policy spiraled into a threat against access to an entire state? Around the globe, governments and citizens watched with growing concern. Two of the world's most peaceful neighbors, long seen as models of cooperation, now teetered on the edge of a crisis. The implications stretched far beyond North America, raising questions about alliances, trade, and the fragility of even the strongest friendships. For ordinary Americans, the idea of a blockade by Canada felt like something out of a political thriller, unthinkable, almost surreal. Yet, as families peered across closed border crossings and truckers waited in endless lines, the reality set in. The connection to Alaska, once taken for granted, was suddenly in jeopardy. Prime Minister Trudeau, flanked by determined provincial leaders, addressed the nation and the world. Their message was resolute. Canada would defend its interests, even if it meant drawing a line in the snow. The unity among Canadian leaders sent a powerful signal that this was not just a political maneuver, but a matter of national pride. The shock in Washington was palpable. For the first time in generations, the United States faced a neighbor willing to push back forcefully, rewriting the rules of a relationship that had long been taken for granted. The era of easy assumptions and quiet cooperation was over. As dawn broke over empty border checkpoints and silent highways, a new reality settled in. The U.S. Canada relationship had entered uncharted territory, and the world was watching to see what would happen next. The standoff began in March 2025 when Donald Trump revived his trade war playbook, announcing sweeping tariffs on Canadian and Mexican goods. The executive order delayed Canadian tariffs by a month, but expanded the list, casting a shadow over North American commerce. Trump framed the move as protecting American jobs, but critics warned it would disrupt supply chains and hurt consumers. The tariffs targeted nearly every sector of the Canadian economy, from steel to agriculture. Canada faced a stark choice: yield to U.S. demands or brace for economic battle. The threat was more than negotiation. It was economic warfare, and Canada prepared to respond. The neighborhood was about to become a battleground. Prime Minister Trudeau wasted no time announcing retaliatory tariffs even before Trump's order was signed. Canada's response was strategic, targeting U.S. goods from key Republican states to maximize political pressure. Trudeau called the tariffs a betrayal of the USMCA and vowed Canada would not be bullied. The message: Canada would defend its sovereignty and economic independence at all costs. "We will not be pushed around," Trudeau declared, rallying support across party lines. The tariffs became a symbol of national pride and resilience. Trudeau's stance empowered provinces to devise their own countermeasures. The fight was now national, with provinces echoing Ottawa's defiance. Canada's response was coordinated, multi-layered, and resolute. The U.S. was no longer facing just Ottawa, it was up against a united Canada. British Columbia's Premier David Eby unveiled the Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act, authorizing punitive tolls on U.S. trucks bound for Alaska. The Alaska Highway, once a symbol of partnership, became a pressure point, vital for Alaska's fresh produce and oil industry supplies. The tolls threatened to spike costs for Alaskan businesses and consumers, from groceries to drilling equipment. The Alaska Trucking Association warned of economic shockwaves across the state. EB's move exploited a vulnerability few in Washington had considered. The bill was a loaded weapon on the negotiating table, turning abstract tariffs into real pain for Alaska. British Columbia was now a key player, not a bystander. The U.S. had to reckon with a province willing to disrupt a vital American supply chain. The stakes had never been higher. For Alaska's 730,000 residents, BC's threat was personal, a direct hit to their daily lives. Prices for essentials like milk and vegetables were set to soar, sparking public anxiety. Alaska's oil and gas sector, reliant on trucked-in supplies, faced costly delays and job risks. The Alaska Trucking Association warned the tolls would destabilize the state's economy. Businesses braced for higher expenses, with costs passed on to every Alaskan. The highway was more than a road, it was Alaska's lifeline to the U.S. The idea of a foreign government controlling that link was deeply unsettling. The crisis exposed Alaska's vulnerability and dependence on Canadian goodwill. As tensions mounted, rhetoric escalated dramatically. Leaders on both sides of the border dug in, refusing to back down or compromise. The air was thick with accusations and warnings, as each side sought to rally their supporters and define the stakes of the conflict. BC Premier David Eby took center stage, accusing former President Trump of attempting to annex Canada. Eby framed the dispute not just as a policy disagreement, but as a fundamental fight for Canadian sovereignty and dignity. He called on Canadians to stand united, warning that their independence was under threat. Eby's fiery speeches electrified crowds across the country. The proposed toll bill quickly became more than a legislative measure. It was transformed into a powerful symbol of national resistance. Canadians from all walks of life rallied behind their premier, waving flags and chanting slogans in support of their government stand. Meanwhile, in Washington, initial disbelief gave way to outrage. U.S. leaders viewed BC's actions as a hostile escalation, a direct challenge to American interests, and a threat to the long-standing partnership between the two nations. Alaska's Senator Dan Sullivan emerged as a leading voice of opposition. He accused Canada of holding his state hostage, arguing that the tolls would devastate Alaskan communities and businesses. Sullivan vowed to fight back, insisting that Alaskans would not be used as pawns in a political standoff. The war of words only deepened the rift. Canadians saw themselves as defending their nation's rights, while Americans interpreted the move as an unjust blockade. The border, once a symbol of friendship, now became a flashpoint for anger and protest on both sides. Senator Sullivan issued stern warnings, promising severe consequences if the tolls were imposed. His statements were echoed by other U.S. lawmakers, who demanded immediate action and threatened retaliation. Threats and counter-threats soon replaced any hope of diplomacy. Negotiations grew tense, with officials on both sides refusing to yield. The crisis seemed to be spiraling out of control, fueled by political posturing and public outrage. The shouting matches in legislative chambers and diplomatic meetings made a peaceful resolution seem increasingly remote. Each new statement only hardened positions and deepened mistrust. The once strong alliance between Canada and the United States was visibly fraying. Trust, built over decades, was now in dangerously short supply. The world could only watch as the relationship between two close allies unraveled before their eyes. Around the globe, people watched anxiously as two of the world's closest allies edged ever closer to open conflict, wondering if cooler heads would prevail before it was too late. British Columbia's bold move inspired a wave of provincial retaliation. Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S., targeting American utility costs. Yukon joined in, halting purchases of American alcohol and restricting U.S. firms from government contracts. BC expanded its measures, banning purchases from Republican-led states and pulling U.S. products from liquor stores. The response was coordinated and precise, inflicting targeted pain on U.S. interests. The dispute was no longer Ottawa versus Washington. It was a united Canadian front. Every province was willing to bear the cost to oppose Trump's tariffs. The message? Canada's resolve was deep and unbreakable. The stakes of the trade war had just skyrocketed. In a bold countermove, Alaska struck back, targeting what many considered British Columbia's economic Achilles heel, its lucrative cruise tourism industry. For years, BC's ports had thrived as essential stops for cruise ships traveling between Seattle and Alaska, bringing in a steady stream of international visitors and fueling local economies. But now, Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska proposed a dramatic shift, waiving the Passenger Vessel Services Act, a century-old law that required foreign-flagged cruise ships to stop in a Canadian port on their way to Alaska. If this waiver passed, cruise ships could bypass BC ports entirely, sailing straight from the U.S. to Alaska without ever docking in Canada. The stakes were enormous. Nearly 2 million cruise passengers passed through BC ports each year, supporting thousands of jobs and generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for cities like Vancouver and Victoria. Local businesses, from hotels and restaurants to souvenir shops and tour operators, all depended on this steady influx of tourists. The threat wasn't just theoretical. During the pandemic, Congress had already waived the law, allowing ships to skip Canadian ports, a move that devastated BC's tourism sector and set a powerful precedent for what could happen again. Senator Sullivan made Alaska's position clear, warning BC officials, "We have enormous leverage over your tourism industry." He argued that the potential damage to BC's tourism sector would far outweigh any revenue British Columbia could hope to gain from tolls or other retaliatory measures. Suddenly, the narrative had shifted. Alaska was no longer the aggrieved party, but a formidable adversary with the power to inflict real economic pain. For BC, the prospect of losing its cruise business was catastrophic. Empty terminals and deserted docks loomed as a stark warning of what was at stake if the standoff continued. The conflict had escalated into a scenario of mutually assured economic destruction, with both sides holding the power to inflict serious harm on the other's economy. With both governments holding powerful cards, the pressure to negotiate a solution mounted. The stakes had never been higher for the future of cross-border tourism and trade. The standoff had become a high-stakes game of brinkmanship, a test of resolve, strategy, and who would ultimately blink first. The tariff and toll war pushed U.S. Canada relations to the brink. What began as a trade dispute now threatened the foundation of North American cooperation. Retaliatory measures exposed deep cracks in a once-model partnership. Both sides faced political deadlock, neither willing to back down without concessions. The risk lasting damage to trust, higher prices and chaos for businesses and citizens. The friendly border was now a line of contention. Only renewed diplomacy could break the cycle of escalation. The standoff was unsustainable, mutually destructive for both nations. Leaders needed to find an off-ramp or risk a new era of hostility. The world waited to see if North America's great neighbors could repair their fractured friendship.